Welcome back to the deep dive. If you've ever found yourself, scrolling through history and you hit those spots where the facts just kind of evaporate
Mm.
into myth or rumor, well, this deep dive is definitely for you. Today, we're grabbing a massive stack of sources, think archaeology reports, old letters, diplomatic records, all that stuff, and we're going to try and synthesize them to really uncover the most, well, plausible truths behind three big foundational and honestly frustrating historical unknowns. Our mission isn't just listing theories, it's about sifting through the evidence, trying to figure out why these stories are still mysteries after all this time. We're going to be jumping around a bit. 16th century Atlantic coast, Bronze Age Anatolia, Victorian London. It's quite a scope.
It is. But the core challenge you find is pretty much the same in each case. It's all about interpreting clues that are ambiguous, filtered through, well, centuries. And that interpretation, that's really where we operate. We can't go into these historical puzzles expecting absolute certainty. History just, it rarely gives you that. We've got to apply a critical lens, constantly asking, okay, how reliable is this piece of evidence considering the real limitations of that specific time period?
Makes sense.
Yeah, like for Roanoke, it's fundamentally a crisis of communication, right?
Yeah.
For the Trojan War, we're wrestling with how oral tradition over centuries turns real conflict into this, embellished myth. And then with Jack the Ripper, we're just completely hamstrung by the lack of modern forensic tools back in 1888. So understanding those limits, the limits of the evidence itself, that's often way more valuable than chasing some definitive answer.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with, I think, one of the most haunting stories in, well, American history, the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke. To really get this, you have to put yourself in John White's shoes. It's 1590. He's finally back at Roanoke Island after 3 years away. Not by choice, mind you. He left, 112, maybe 121 English settlers there in 1587, including his own daughter. And his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English kid born in the Americas.
And that delay, those 3 agonizing years, that was really the first killer blow.
Yeah.
It wasn't just poor planning, though that might have played a part. The big issue was the Anglo-Spanish War. The entire English Navy, pretty much every available ship, was pulled into fighting the Spanish Armada.
Ah, okay.
England was facing this huge threat, right?
Yeah.
So their priority completely shifted. It wasn't colonization anymore, it was survival. And that tiny settlement just left completely hanging.
Yeah.
Unsupported.
So White finally gets back, and the settlement, the palisade walls, they're still standing. But inside, nothing. No settlers, no sign of a fight, no bodies, no burned buildings, just empty.
Yeah.
Which is almost scarier, isn't it?
It really is. And it fundamentally changes the mystery. There had been some violent massacre, say, by a hostile tribe. Well, you'd expect to see evidence, wouldn't you?
Yeah, graves, weapons.
Exactly. Graves, weapons, maybe burned structures, signs of a struggle. The fact that the site was basically untouched, just empty, it really argues against immediate violence or some kind of mass death from disease right there.
But they did leave clues. 2 very specific, very cryptic clues. The main one, the one everyone knows, is CROATOAN, carved apparently quite cleanly into a post or maybe a tree. And then a secondary clue, maybe a bit more ambiguous, just CRO etched on a fence post. So when White saw CROATOAN, given what he knew, what he arranged with the colonists before he left, what was his immediate reaction likely to be?
Honestly, probably a moment of profound, if maybe fragile, relief. Yeah, because White and the colonists, they had an agreement. If they had to move, they'd carve their destination. But crucially, if they were in distress, if they were leaving under duress, they were supposed to carve a Maltese cross above the name. And the key thing here is the absence of that cross, that missing distress signal. It strongly suggested to White, okay, this was deliberate, this was planned, this wasn't violent. It pointed towards a relocation to CROATOAN Island, which is about 50 miles south.
Okay, so a planned move. But why move? What pushed them?
Well, that brings us to the pressures. Even if it was planned, the move itself was almost certainly forced by some pretty immense challenges. Which leads us to hypothesis B, right? The environmental and political stuff.
Right. Our sources dig into the massive survival challenges this tiny group faced. We're talking severe environmental factors. There's climate data, actually, from dendrochronology tree rings, basically.
Yeah, tree rings are amazing for this.
And they point to a really severe drought, like a 7-year drought, gripping that exact part of North America right when they were there, 1587 to 1589.
Think about that. A drought like that would have just devastated any attempt they made at farming at growing their own food.
Right, immediately undermining their ability to feed themselves, forcing some really radical decisions.
Absolutely. So you've got the drought plus the harsh winters you get on the Outer Banks. They were probably right on the brink. And these internal pressures, they made dealings with the native tribes, whether alliances or conflicts, basically unavoidable. They seem to have had a relatively peaceful start with the Croatan tribe specifically, but there were growing tensions with other, perhaps more powerful groups nearby, like the CROATOAN or the Chawanik. If your food runs out, you basically have three options, right? Starve, fight, or integrate.
And that leads us straight into what many think is the most compelling theory. Hypothesis A, assimilation and integration. The CROATOAN clue points directly their relocation to live among the Croatan people on what's now Hatteras Island. And the physical evidence here, this is what takes it from just, speculation to a pretty grounded historical theory. Our sources talk about archaeological digs on Hatteras Island that show this remarkable cultural blending.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Teams digging in the area believed to be the Croatan settlement.
Yeah.
They found artifacts that are just profoundly ambiguous. You get 16th century English items, bits of copper, slate pencils, fragments of fancy pottery.
Okay.
But they're mixed right in with native stuff, not just alongside it, but sometimes even modified or clearly used within native settlements. And crucial find, pottery shards. Some look like Native American styles, but they show signs of like English modification or use. Maybe they learned to make pots the native way just to boil water or cook. This isn't evidence of a massacre, right? This is evidence of sustained, pretty intimate contact. It looks like the English learned to adapt native techniques simply to survive.
And then you've got the oral history to add to the physical stuff, which we can't just dismiss, especially when we're talking about societies that didn't rely on writing in the same way.
Exactly. Local tribes, especially groups like the Lumbee and others in the Carolinas, they've held on to these oral traditions for centuries. Stories about welcoming newcomers or people with pale skin into their communities way back when.
So put it all together?
Yeah, the combination is pretty powerful. You've got the lack of a distress signal. You've got these blended artifacts showing close contact. And you've got this enduring oral history. It paints a picture where the settlers didn't just vanish or die out. They survived by essentially stopping being purely English.
They assimilated.
They assimilated, they adapted, took on a new identity maybe, and eventually just sort of faded into the broader native population over generations.
Okay, but we should touch on hypothesis C too, these alternative fates. What about the idea that maybe the group split up? Is there any evidence for that?
Well, there is some really interesting work being done further inland. Recent archaeological surveys, focusing more west, near what's now Bertie County, they found traces of what looks like a small fortified village, a palisaded village, but way away from the coast.
Inland.
Miles inland. It suggests that, yeah, maybe while the main group followed the CROATOAN sign south, perhaps a smaller faction, maybe feeling more vulnerable, they splintered off, tried to find a safer spot inland, set up a secondary settlement.
So John White looks towards CROATOAN, maybe misses this other group entirely. They could have gone inland and just never reconnected.
It's plausible.
And just quickly, the darker outcomes, massacres, disease, you still maintain the lack of physical evidence is the strongest argument against those.
Absolutely. Look, the settlers vanished between 1587 and 1590. Even if relations with some local tribes soured, the sheer scale of violence needed to wipe out over 100 people, men, women, children, without leaving any trace. No mass graves, no signs of a major battle, not even scattered belongings found later. It just strains credibility. The path that requires the fewest assumptions and fits the evidence we do have points towards survival through assimilation. The great mystery of Roanoke might actually be a story of, well, radical adaptation.
That's quite a shift in perspective, trading a story of tragedy for one of survival. Okay, let's leave the harsh realities of 16th century colonial life now. We're going to jump thousands of years into the past, to a time where the line between history and, well, poetry gets really blurry. We're heading to the Bronze Age to ask that huge question. Was the Trojan War real?
Right, and this shift, it demands we completely recalibrate how we approach the evidence. With Roanoke, we were dealing with, gaps in historical documents from the time. Here, we're grappling with this massive temporal gap, Homer's Iliad. It was written down centuries after the events it supposedly describes.
A huge gap.
Yeah, so our job becomes finding the historical kernel, the truth buried underneath all that epic poetry.
And the poetry, I mean, it's incredible. Homer's Iliad gives us this decade-long siege, gods literally meddling on the battlefield, heroes like Achilles and Hector. It's the defining epic of Western literature, really. And it sets up this narrative that the whole war was fought because Paris snatched Helen away.
But history, as we know, is rarely that simple or that romantic.
Yeah.
The search for the actual historical Troy, it eventually led archaeologists to this site called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. It's strategically placed on a hill overlooking the Aegean. And what they found there wasn't just one city. It was this incredible testament to human endurance, like 9 different layers of settlement built one on top of the other, going back maybe 5,000 years.
Wow, 9 layers. So the trick then is matching the destruction layer, the right layer, to the time the Trojan War supposedly happened. Which layer shows the scars that might line up with Homer's story?
We generally zero in on 2 main contenders,
Mm-hmm.
Troy VI and more specifically Troy VIII. Troy VI, which dates roughly from 1700 to 1250 BCE, shows these massive, really impressive fortifications. It suggests a powerful, wealthy city definitely capable of defending itself against serious attack. Structurally and time-wise, it aligns with a potential Bronze Age superpower.
Okay, but I think the sources often point to Troy VIII as the layer with the most compelling evidence for that violent end, the one that fits the traditional timeline better.
Precisely. Troy VIII dated roughly between 1250 and maybe 1180 BCE. That's the layer that shows clear signs of a sudden, catastrophic destruction by fire. And digs in that layer revealed something else interesting. Narrow, kind of hastily built houses crammed inside the older, massive walls of Troy VI. It suggests maybe a population surge, perhaps refugees crowding in just before a final siege. And crucially, in this layer, Troy VIII, archaeologists found unburied human remains and concentrations of bronze arrowheads actually embedded in the walls and on the floor levels.
Okay, that physical evidence, arrowheads, charred walls, bodies, that definitely points to a major conflict. But does it prove the Trojan War? You know, the one from the Iliad, this 10-year siege by a unified Greek army.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It
Right.
confirms a war, a nasty one.
Mm.
But not necessarily the war, Homer's war. What's really important is that the destruction of Troy VIII aligns perfectly with this broader cataclysmic event happening across the region, the collapse of the entire Bronze Age system.
Right.
We have to see this conflict, this destruction of Troy, within the wider geopolitical context of around 1200 BCE.
So if it wasn't just about Helen, what was the real motive likely to be? Our sources seem to point towards something much more mundane, economics and political power.
Exactly. Troy, or the city the Hittites called Wilusa in their records, which most scholars now accept, is the same place as Hisarlik Troy. It was positioned perfectly near the Dardanelles Strait. That meant it effectively controlled maritime trade, shipping passage, between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea.
A bottleneck for trade. That makes it incredibly valuable, way more valuable, frankly, than any single Spartan queen, right?
It was a choke point, pure and simple. Controlling Troy meant controlling access to vital resources, controlling wealth, controlling trade routes. That geopolitical reality, it provides a solid, understandable, very pragmatic motive for war. And when you combine that economic incentive with the political instability of the whole era, well, the picture gets a bit clearer.
What instability are we talking about?
The whole system was collapsing. Around the 12th century BCE, you see the fall of the great Bronze Age empires. The Mycenaeans in Greece, their palace centers were burning. Their society was dissolving internally. The powerful Hittite Empire in Anatolia, neighbors to Troy, was also disintegrating. This created this huge power vacuum across the Eastern Mediterranean. It was an era of famine, mass migrations, widespread regional conflict, including those mysterious raids by the so-called Sea Peoples. The destruction of Troy VIII probably wasn't some isolated epic event. It was likely one violent episode in a whole chain of catastrophic failures across the region.
So the Trojan War was less this grand quest for love and more like a brutal, maybe calculated grab for strategic resources during a time of widespread chaos and collapse.
Fundamentally, yes.
Yeah.
That seems much more plausible. And this is where we have to bring Homer back in and the role of storytelling. Remember, Homer's account, formalized maybe 400 years after Troy VIII burned. That's a massive gap in time.
So how does oral tradition take a messy, pragmatic, regional war and turn it into something with, interfering gods and giant wooden horses?
Well, oral poets, the rhapsodes, they weren't historians in our sense. They were more like curators of collective cultural memory. Their job was to educate, to inspire, to create a shared identity. So over those 4 centuries, the story of a pivotal, probably terrifying period of destruction, the fall of Wilusa Troy, it got simplified, it got elevated.
Hmm.
They likely blended genuine memories from the Mycenaean era, maybe descriptions of certain types of armor, like Ajax's big shield, with customs and ideas from the later periods when the poems were actually taking shape, creating this composite, idealized narrative.
And the wooden horse.
The wooden horse is almost certainly not historical fact. It's a brilliant dramatic device, a literary invention to explain how Troy's supposedly impregnable walls were finally breached. It makes for a great story.
But the sources do try to anchor the story in some reality, right? Through external validation, like those Hittite records you mentioned.
Exactly. That's the crucial link back to history. We have these diplomatic texts, cuneiform tablets found in the Hittite capital, Hattusa. And they specifically mention a client state or neighboring power called Wilusa. And they mention conflicts and diplomatic dealings between Wilusa and a group called the Ahiawa,
And the Ahiawa are...
widely believed by scholars to be the Mycenaean Greeks, the Achaeans, as Homer calls them. So these texts provide external contemporary evidence. There was a major city at Hisarlik called Wilusa. It was politically significant, and it was involved in conflicts with Greek-speaking peoples right around the time Troy the Athia was destroyed. So the synthesis, the most likely picture, is this. The Trojan War wasn't the single decade-long romantic siege Homer described. It was more likely a cultural memory, maybe centered around one particularly brutal attack on Troy the Athia, but representing a composite of regional struggles. Struggles driven by economic need and political ambition during the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. Homer, or the tradition he represents, then took that memory, standardized it, blended fact and fear and fiction, and created this foundational narrative for the entire Greek world.
It takes an incredible amount of critical thinking to look at something as powerful as the Iliad and try to tease out the historical truth underneath. That's definitely why we're here. Okay, let's jump forward again. From the Bronze Age all the way to the 19th century. We're moving from ruins buried by time to clues obscured by, well, institutional failure and huge gaps in technology. We're going to Whitechapel, London, 1888 to tackle maybe the most famous cold case ever, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Right, and when we step into Whitechapel in 1888, you have to remember the atmosphere. It was just a place of extreme poverty, incredible overcrowding, disease, anonymity. It was, frankly, the perfect hunting ground for a predator. The panic that gripped London after those brutal, very specific murders of the 5 women, usually considered the canonical 5. Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. That panic came from 2 places. The sheer terror of the killer, yes, but also the growing realization that the police seemed utterly incapable of catching him.
And that failure, it points right back to the limitations of the investigation at the time, doesn't it? What were the huge challenges facing 19th century police and forensics that basically allowed a serial killer to operate seemingly with impunity?
Oh, the challenges were systemic, and they were massive. First, just the physical environment. Think about it. Dense London smog, gas lighting that cast deep shadows, making visibility terrible, narrow, twisting alleyways.
Yeah.
Plus, witness testimony often came from people who were transient, maybe intoxicated, deeply impoverished, or just plain terrified to talk to the police clearly. And then, crucially, they lacked the absolute basics of modern criminal investigation. There was no standardized fingerprinting system in widespread use yet. Ballistics, crime scene photography, all incredibly rudimentary or non-existent in a practical sense. DNA, centuries away.
Right.
On top of that, the police effort itself was fragmented. You had the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police with overlapping jurisdictions right in the murder area. This apparently led to rivalry, poor communication, information hoarding, instead of a coordinated, centralized investigation.
So even if the killer did leave clues, the police just didn't have the tech or maybe the organization to effectively find them or process them. Okay, despite all that chaos, they did end up with a huge suspect pool, didn't they? Over 100 names mentioned at various points, from laborers right up to aristocrats. Let's break down the main types of candidates that our sources seem to find most plausible.
Yeah, we can sort of categorize them based on things like motive, opportunity, and importantly, skill. First, you've got your local candidates. These are compelling just because of proximity, someone living or working right there in Whitechapel, maybe a barber, a local butcher, someone in the trades. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish barber who lived in the area, is often brought up in this context. He fits the profile of someone with the immediate opportunity, someone who could potentially blend back into that dense, chaotic population very quickly after a crime.
Okay, the local possibility. What else?
Then you have the transient candidates. This often brings up the sailor theory. If the killer was a sailor on shore leave, it could explain a few things. The sudden appearance, the cluster of very specific violent murders over a short period, and then the abrupt disappearance.
Right, the timeline fits.
Yeah, their ship arrives, they commit the crimes perhaps, and then they just sail away to another port. It neatly explains why the murder stopped when they did, provides a clear boundary.
But maybe the most chilling theory, and the one that seems to connect most directly to the crime scenes themselves, involves the skilled candidates. Someone with anatomical or surgical knowledge.
Yes, this is often seen as key. The nature of the mutilations inflicted on some of the victims, the apparent precision, the specific organs removed. In some cases, it strongly suggests someone who knew their way around human anatomy. That points towards maybe a doctor, a medical student, perhaps even a very skilled butcher or slaughterman used to handling carcasses.
That specific skill seems crucial.
That precision, that apparent knowledge, is really the defining characteristic that elevates the Ripper beyond just a random, frenzied attacker. It suggests someone with specialized knowledge. Now, I have to be careful, it doesn't automatically mean a famous, established surgeon. It could have been a student, someone working in a related trade, even a quack. But that skill requirement, it does significantly narrow the field, regardless of the suspect's social standing.
Okay, so you have these potential suspects, but the whole investigation gets completely derailed, or at least massively complicated, by the media frenzy, fueled partly by the killer himself, maybe. Let's talk about the letters. The ones sent to newspapers, to the police, signed Jack the Ripper. Were they actually helpful or just a huge problem?
They were an utter, unmitigated liability, a huge problem. The intense media attention created this perfect storm for hoaxes and attention-seeking. Yes, the famous Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard, they effectively gave the killer his iconic name and terrified the public further. But the vast majority of the hundreds of letters received, almost certainly hoaxes. Handwriting analysis back then was basic, subjective. The police wasted precious time and incredibly scarce resources chasing down dozens, maybe hundreds of false leads generated by journalists wanting a scoop, or just cruel pranksters feeding off the fear.
Wow.
These letters actively muddied the waters. They created noise, distraction. They probably ensured the real killer, if he wasn't writing them, could just melt away even more easily.
And the end of the murders is almost as mysterious as the beginning, isn't it? After Mary Jane Kelly's incredibly brutal murder in November 1888, they just stopped. That abrupt end is like the final major clue, or lack thereof.
It is. It creates this clear temporal fence. Why did they stop so suddenly? The most logical explanation suggests the killer's opportunity ended somehow. Either they died, maybe suicide, maybe from disease, which was rampant in the slums anyway, or they were permanently removed from the scene, perhaps imprisoned for some other lesser crime, totally unrelated to the murders. Or, fitting that transient theory, they simply left the country for good.
Okay, now this is where the Ripper mystery gets really modern and complicated. Fast forward over a century, we keep seeing attempts to crack the case using modern technologies, specifically these claims involving DNA analysis, usually focusing on a shawl supposedly found near Catherine Edda's body. If a modern DNA test points, supposedly conclusively, to a specific historical suspect, like Aaron Kosminski again, how skeptical should we really be about that?
We have to be extremely skeptical. And this is where modern science clashes hard with historical integrity.
Right.
That shawl, okay, let's assume it was found near Edo's body, though even that's debated. It's over 130 years old.
Right, very old evidence.
Very old. And
Yeah.
think about its history. Even if you have incredibly powerful modern techniques, like PCR testing that can amplify tiny degraded DNA fragments, the massive issue is the chain of custody and contamination.
Contamination.
Think about how many people might have handled that shawl over 130 plus years. Police officers in 1888, mortuary staff, private collectors maybe, museum curators, forensic scientists in different eras. The risk of contamination from anyone who touched it, breathed on it, stored it improperly, even decades or a century later is just enormous, especially with trace DNA. So a modern DNA link might prove that DNA matching a descendant of a suspect was on the shawl at some point. But it absolutely cannot definitively prove when that DNA got there or that it came directly from the killer during the commission of the crime in 1888. The provenance is just too shaky.
So it's weighing the high technical certainty of a DNA match against the really low historical certainty of where that DNA actually came from and when. How do historians and analysts handle that conflict?
We have to prioritize the contextual evidence from the time. Does the person the DNA points to actually fit the known profile? Did they have the opportunity, the likely skill set suggested by the mutilations? Were they even in Whitechapel during that narrow window in autumn 1888? If the DNA points to someone who, historically, just doesn't fit the circumstances, then the most likely explanation isn't that we've solved it, it's that the DNA evidence itself is compromised, probably contamination. And this is why those really wild theories, it was a member of the royal family, or a famous artist, or some complex Masonic conspiracy, why they tend to flourish, despite having virtually no credible evidence. People often prefer a grand, complex narrative, maybe involving the elite, over the more mundane, but possibly more horrifying reality. It might have just been a local predator, terrifyingly skillful for his time, who simply evaded a police force that wasn't equipped to catch him.
Yeah. The Jack the Ripper case really does show that sometimes the historical context itself, the limitations of the era, that's the most unbreakable lock on the mystery, isn't it? Hashtag outro. Wow. Okay, this deep dive, it's taken us across, what, civilizations, centuries, Roanoke, Troy, Whitechapel? But the thread connecting them all seems to be the same thing, trying to interpret these tiny fragments of information through the really murky lens of time.
Exactly, and each case teaches us something different about that process, I think. Roanoke.
Uh-huh.
It suggests that sometimes an absence of evidence, specifically evidence of violence, might actually be evidence of something else, of adaptation, of survival. The settlers likely chose assimilation as a path to survive colonial failure, showing incredible resilience, really. Troy shows us the immense power of cultural narrative, how real, probably brutal economic and political conflict during the Bronze Age collapse got transformed over centuries into this idealized epic poem. It proves history is always filtered, often embellished, to serve the needs of later generations.
Yeah, that transformation is key. Yeah.
And Jack the Ripper. That case just demonstrates the hard, unavoidable limits imposed by technology and, frankly, systemic organizational failures.
Yeah.
Sometimes the reason a puzzle remains unsolved isn't lack of effort. It's simply that the tools needed didn't exist at the time.
Right.
So in every single case, real knowledge is gained not necessarily by finding that one definitive answer, because often you can't. It's gained by understanding precisely what the limits of the evidence are for that specific historical moment.
So we've explored how Roanoke colonists likely adapted their whole identity to survive, how ancient Greeks adapted historical memory into poetry that lasted millennia. That leaves us with maybe one last provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry away. We're living right now in an era of, well, information overload, right? Intense political division, conflicting data streams everywhere you look. What modern puzzle, what crisis, what ongoing event, what conflict that feels completely obscured by noise right now? What is it that future historians, maybe 500 years from now, will look back on? And despite having access to all our digital records, all our data, they'll still struggle profoundly to truly interpret and unravel it. What story are we collectively failing to record accurately, or maybe even understand clearly right now?